لما احكي اسمع.
لو سمحت، لو دكتور لو سمحت.
انا لو ادري هالديناصور بيجي وياي والله ما
ما فيك تحسبك علي. لا لو سمحت.
لا بدي ايدك علي. لا ايدك علي بعد.
يا لو سمحت.
ارفع على ايدك.
لو سمحت.
ما ترفعها. ما ترفعها.
حضرتك ما ارفعها.
محمد الصدر. محمد الصدر. كلامك معي. كل مرة رديت علي. كلامك معي. انا يا بأمك سكت. قاطعني ما يخليني احكي.
لو سمحت دكتور. عطى المجال.
Thank you and welcome. My name is Bill Crawford, and here today we're going to talk about conflict, resolving conflict, dealing with conflict, moving from chaos to calm. Or, put another way, dealing with difficult people versus them dealing with you. I don't know, anybody ever dealt with any difficult people? They're everywhere, aren't they? It's amazing. I don't know. And have you noticed how chaotic it can be in this sense? So another way we could look at this is dealing with conflict without losing your head. Because I think it's fair to say that when we find ourselves in conflict, we often might lose our head. We'll say something we really didn't mean, we'll do something we wish we didn't do, or we really won't say what needs to be said. So today we're going to look at conflict from three perspectives. Number one, what are the underlying causes of conflict? How can a simple disagreement turn so quickly into what seems like a vicious cycle that almost seems to feed off of itself? Number two, when you find yourself in the middle of a conflict, how can we deal with that person in a way that not only resolves the conflict, but actually taps into their internal motivation to hear what we have to say as valuable? And number three, how can we interact with people more proactively in the beginning to actually diffuse conflict before it starts? Now, I'm going to be talking about difficult people today because I'm going to assume that everybody out here is probably pretty good at dealing with normal people, right? I mean, folks that are willing to sit down with you and have a normal conversation, even when there's a disagreement. If someone's willing to sit down with us, we're probably pretty good at that. It's that difficult person, isn't it? It kind of gets under our skin. So here's what I'd like you to be doing. Start thinking of the adjectives you would use to describe any difficult person you have ever encountered, right? Now, this may not be the adjectives you would actually say to their face, okay? I mean, but way deep down in the pit of your stomach, you know, when you're dealing with this person, think of the adjectives you might be using. If you're like most of us, you think of them as rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant, demanding, rigid, crazy, and we could probably spend the rest of our time together making this list, couldn't we? So here's what I'd like for you to do. I'd like for you to imagine in your mind that this represents all of the difficult people you've ever encountered. So if you had some adjectives that aren't on this list, just imagine they are, and it will work. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that when we find ourselves dealing with them, we find ourselves sometimes reacting in certain ways. Not so much how we should react, but way deep down in the pit of our stomach, you know, when we're dealing with these rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant, demanding, rigid, and crazy people. How do we find ourselves reacting? Well, we become defensive, frustrated. Notice how frustrating it is to deal with one of these folks? We sometimes get loud, trying to get louder than them, or we withdraw. It can be kind of a fight or flight experience. We feel superior sometimes. Don't you know who you're dealing with, you know? Confused, like, why are you treating me this way, you know? And then we get crazy. Now, here's something really, really important. These are the difficult people, and we are the nice people. Now, why would I say that they're the difficult people and we're the nice people when it kind of looks like we're doing the same thing? Because they started it, didn't they? I mean, isn't that true? I mean, remember when you were a little kid and you had a conflict? Well, they did. We were having a perfectly wonderful day. They came into our lives. They did that, and we found ourselves doing that, which would be bad enough if it stopped there. But have you noticed that it doesn't? Because when they do this and we do that, what do? More, right? Don't you think they become even more rude, obnoxious, loud, arrogant? Which, of course, has us reacting again. Which, of course, has them becoming more difficult, and we react, and they become more difficult, and react, and 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 difficult, until we create what I call the cycle of conflict. Does this look familiar to anyone here in the room? Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize how challenging it can be to be caught in that cycle of conflict. I mean, let's think of the problems that might exist if this cycle of conflict became our relationship with that person. Well, obviously communication would stop, right? And productivity, or if we had to deal with them in any way effectively, they wouldn't be listening to anything we had to say. And if we really needed information from them, they wouldn't be giving it. So that's one of the problems. Second problem is, they'll probably go tell somebody. Have you noticed that? Because this is really interesting. Guess who they see as the difficult person? Us, exactly. They say, well, they just got defensive, frustrated, and withdrawal. One of them looked really confused, didn't know what was going on. In other words, they see our reaction to them as us being the difficult person, and they go tell somebody. And you notice how challenging it can be to have someone who is out there spreading negative PR about you or your department or your organization. I mean, it's amazingly problematic. Now, also, I think it's important to recognize is this cycle of conflict can be very stressful, right? This is my second PBS special. The first one was called All Stressed Up and Nowhere to Go. And in speaking to dealing with stress, a lot of people talked about how difficult people really were problematic in their lives and created a lot of stress. I mean, just imagine this. You're sitting in your office or your home or you're being just fine, and all of a sudden this person comes into your life and they're all upset and they're all difficult. You're fine for a while, but all of a sudden you seem to catch it, right? And all of a sudden you're doing this, and they could even leave the room and you're still doing it, you know? And then someone else will come in and say, excuse me, you go, what do you want? In other words, we can take this into our next encounter with our significant other or, you know, our colleague or our coworker, or again, we save it up and take it home, right, where we kick the dog or something like that. So we got to do something about this stressful experience here. Matter of fact, there's a really nice quote about how resentment plays a role in this. It says, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Isn't that true? I mean, they have no clue that it's happening, right? I mean, they're away somewhere, but that poison is actually eating us up inside. So we really got to change the situation. So in changing it, we've got to recognize that if we stay caught in the cycle of conflict, it won't work. What do? I suggest we raise our awareness of what's really going on here. There's a great quote that speaks to that. By Albert Einstein, it says, problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. So what we're going to do is actually raise our awareness of what's really going on here. Now, a lot of people think it is the facts or what happens to us that actually causes our experience of life. I'm going to suggest, however, it's not so much the facts. The facts do play a role. They are actually filtered through our beliefs. And it is our beliefs that create our experience of life. Let me give you an example. You know, a long time ago, most of the people on the planet believed that the world was flat, right? Now, the facts were, of course, the world was round, but everybody believed it was flat. And when a ship sailed out and didn't come back, what did they think? Fell off the edge of the earth. You see, our beliefs create our interpretations, or how we give meaning to whatever it is we see. A lot of times our interpretations are much more congruent with our beliefs than they are with the facts. So, they believed the world was flat. Ship sailed out too far, must have fallen off the edge of the earth. They would expect, therefore, that if another ship sailed out too far, it too would fall off the edge of the earth, right? Our beliefs and interpretations create our expectations, what we expect to happen next. Based on this expectation that a ship was going to fall off the edge of the earth, we would probably be kind of concerned, if not frightened, about getting on ships, right? Our expectations create our emotions, how we feel about things. Based on this fear of getting on ships concerned, what we would do is then we would probably avoid ships. You see, our emotions create our behaviors. And what we would think, because we had avoided ships based on this belief that the world is flat, is that, see, we are safe. Because we know the world is flat, I'm not getting on a ship, and therefore our behaviors, emotions, expectations, interpretations then go to reinforce our beliefs. So, what we're going to do this section is we're going to look a little bit more specifically at when we find ourselves dealing with one of these difficult people, how can we interact with them in a way that actually taps into their internal motivation to hear what we have to say as valuable. Not only just resolves the conflict, because that's kind of like putting out a fire, you know. And when you put out a fire, you always know there's some smoldering embers underneath there, right? So rather than have us just going around putting out fires, what I'd like to show you how to do is actually change the relationship with that person so they become less of an enemy and more of an ally. How to do that? Well, I think it's important to recognize that there are probably some reasons that at least most difficult people think they have a reason to be difficult with us. And remember that quote from Albert Einstein, problems are not solved at the same level of awareness that created them. So what we want to do is raise our awareness of what is behind their difficult behavior so we can deal with it more effectively. I also think it's really important that we get really clear what we're going for, what's our goal here. And I think it's important to recognize that what we want to do for the most part is communicate with people. We want them to hear what we have to say. We want them to give us the information we need. I'm going to suggest that in order for communication to go forward, two forces must be present, an active and a receptive. Now notice I didn't say active and passive, I said active and receptive. The reason I make that distinction is a lot of us grow up seeing the active perspective as the most powerful one. I mean, just think of being a kid. When your parents were talking to you, for the most part, they were being active, right? And you were supposed to be at least somewhat receptive. So what I think is important to recognize is we have to be careful about going immediately to that active perspective. For instance, let me ask you the question. What do you think these people are going to be, more active or receptive? Active, exactly. They're going to be actively resistant. So if we're active right back, here's what we create, that cycle of conflict. Now let me demonstrate to you how the receptive perspective or the receptive position can be valuable and powerful even. I'm going to ask a friend of mine to come up. Steve Butler. Let's give Steve a hand. Thank you, Steve. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I've asked Steve to come up and help me demonstrate this. Steve, what I'd like for you to do is hit my hand and say, Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
All right. Now, in our culture, when someone hits you, especially if it's a guy, what are you supposed to do? Hit him back. So I'd go, no, Steve, you're wrong. And you'd go,
no, I think you're wrong.
Oh, I know you're wrong.
No, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
No, you're wrong. So here we go. Yeah. We have just created the cycle of conflict. Have you noticed? The more I escalate, the more he escalates, and here we go. Now, I say in our culture, when someone hits you, you're supposed to hit them back. In other cultures, that's not the same thing.
ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم وما يلقاها إلا الذين صبروا وما يلقاها إلا ذو حظ عظيم وإما ينزغنك من الشيطان نزغ فاستعذ بالله إنه هو السميع العليم.
We want them to cooperate with us more, but they're being actively resistant. What do? Try that again. Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
Now look, he's already moving in this direction. It took very little energy for me to take him, moving him in this direction, and turn the conversation around. Now, here's what I did do, and here's what I didn't do. I didn't take him and throw him across this room, right? I mean, he would have gotten angry. And I didn't even drag him across the room. He was already moving in this direction. I just basically went in the direction he was going and then began to take control of the situation and turn the situation around. Now, here's something really, really important. You can't do this manipulatively, right? Like, now I know how to wrap these difficult people around my finger. I'll get them. Because if a difficult person thinks you're manipulating them, they will resist you, right? They have to believe that you're going in their direction in a way that actually honors what they have to say. And that is really important. Try that again. Bill, you're wrong.
Bill, you're wrong.
All right, he's already going in this direction. Now you give them something they want. Steve, would you like to sit down?
Yes, very much.
Let's give Steve That is the power of the receptive position. I think it's fair to say, however, that most of us didn't grow up doing it that way. And so what we've got to do is learn how to do it that way. In learning how to do it that way, I think it's important to recognize that there are probably some reasons why people are difficult with us in the first place. And the more that we understand those reasons, the more we can interact with them on purpose. For instance, would it be fair to say that one of the reasons that people are difficult with us is they have a need to tell us something? I mean, you've probably been in this situation, right, where you have a need to tell somebody something and they're not listening. Have you noticed how frustrating that is? And so what do? We get louder and more insistent and more difficult trying to get them to listen to us. Well, it's important to recognize that difficult people do the same thing. So, when someone has a need to tell you something, and it's one of the reasons they're being difficult, what I suggest we do is listen. Kind of sounds like a no-brainer, right? But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of times when we listen, we're not really listening, are we? Especially when we're dealing with one of these difficult people, right? We're either going, yeah, give me a break, go ahead. Well, in other words, we're just letting them vent, or we're forming our response to them, right? Well, when they get through, I'm going to hit them with this. Or we're making grocery lists in our mind, or we're doing something other than really listening to them. But remember, if one of the reasons they're being difficult with us is because they have a need to tell us something, and we're not really listening, they have to raise the ante. They have to become more difficult in order to get us to pay attention. We don't want to motivate them to become more difficult. So we listen, but we don't just listen to let them vent. We actually listen for what's important to them. Because what's fascinating about when people are venting, what they're actually doing is giving us the key to their cooperation. Because they're telling us what's important to them. We want to be able to draw on that later in the model when it's time for us to offer a solution. So the more we listen for the key to their cooperation, the more we have that valuable information to draw upon later. Also, we want to make sure that they really believe that we've heard what they've said. How could we demonstrate to them that we've actually truly heard what they've said? Paraphrase it back, yes. Now, it's important that we paraphrase it versus just repeat it back word for word, because it has almost become a cliche in our society. In other words, if someone comes up to you and says, I'm really feeling frustrated and angry, and you say, I hear you're feeling frustrated and angry. They'll slap you, right? I mean, they don't care about that. That just says, I heard what you said, but it doesn't say I really understood what you said. What you want to do is paraphrase back, because when you paraphrase, you tell them what you understood them to say. Let me make sure I got this right. Here's what I heard you say, or here's what I understood you to say. Then you say it, then you ask, did I get it right? Because whether they say yes or no, it's really valuable information. If they say yes, you know, they now know that they've heard you and you've heard them. And that's now a valuable step in moving forward. If they say no, it means you've missed something. And you want to make sure not to miss something, because remember, that is the key to their cooperation. Now, would it be fair to say that another reason people are difficult with us is because sometimes they're afraid that we don't understand the seriousness of their problem. And most people believe that this problem is serious and they have a right to be upset, right? Fair to say? That's why when we tell them to calm down, again, they don't say, thank you for sharing. They get more upset because they hear our telling them to calm down as us implying that we don't see their problem as a serious one. So here's where I'm going to encourage you to empathize. Now, I know this sounds like psychobabble, so hold on for a moment. When I say empathize, what I just really mean is you might say something like, you know, I can understand how you'd be upset by this. That lets them know that you understand the seriousness of their problem. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with them. And that's important, because a lot of us have that confused. A lot of us say, well, I can't say that I can understand because I don't agree. Well, it's important to make a distinction between understanding what someone says and agreeing with it. A lot of times you won't necessarily agree with their position, but you can understand how they'd be upset. The challenge is to empathize with them so they no longer need to defend their right to be upset or need to defend the seriousness of their problem. Okay. Another reason that people are difficult with us sometimes is they don't believe that we really value their input and their ideas. And they're saying, hey, well, if you don't care what I think, why should I care what you think, right? Here is where you ask them. You basically say, what are your ideas for solving this? And would you be willing to work with me? This does two things. Number one, it begins to move the cycle of conflict into the present and into the problem-solving stage. Remember, most conflicts are often about who said what in the past, who did what. That, by the way, is an unwinnable argument. They will remember it one way, you will remember it another way. So when you can say, what are your ideas about solving this, you begin to have them generate solutions. Plus, you learn more about their key, because in their solutions, they're going to tell you what's important to them. Plus, you begin to move the whole experience into the problem-solving stage. So let's look at what we've done so far. So far, we have dealt with them by listening, empathizing, and asking. All receptive skills. That's that when I was leading Steve across the stage here, I was taking that receptive position, but in the meantime, I was learning more about the situation so that I can then move into the active stage. It is important that you do move into the active stage, because if all you do is listen, empathize, and ask, they'll think you're not going to address the problem, right? So you do move into the problem-solving stage. However, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes they have some fear about that. For instance, they may be afraid that either we're not going to address the problem, or that if we win, they lose. Or if we create the solution, somehow they will not be represented in it. Here is where you take all the information you have gathered in the listening, empathizing, and asking, and you blend that with your ideas so that you begin to move into the problem-solving stage, taking the active role now by blending their ideas with yours. It means you're going to come up with a solution that they're going to be more invested in and more willing to cooperate with you around, because it has some of their ideas in it. Okay. Let's look and see what we've done so far. Listening, empathizing, asking, and problem solving. The fourth thing we do is problem solving. Now, here's what most of us do that doesn't work with difficult people. When people bring us a problem, most of us move into the problem solving mode. And the problem with that is they're often not ready to hear that solution. So it becomes a PLEA, or a plea for their attention. I'm encouraging you to recognize the value of having problem solving being the very last thing you do, because at that point you have actually helped them move to a place where they're more open to hear what you have to say as valuable. Well, here's where I encourage you to actually change the LEAP model into the LEAPS model by speaking in a way that doesn't put them on the defensive or remembering the "you stupid idiot" rule. And again, what that does is change the LEAP model into the LEAPS model and becomes more of a complete model. The LEAP model is also very important to keep in mind, because you want to make sure you're practicing this. This will take practice. I hope you found this to be valuable. You have been a great group. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.